Bitcoiners, pre-coiners, no coiners, new coiners, Swan Force members, welcome to Swan Lounge, a weekly show in which you get to hang out with the Swan team and some of our friends from the incredibly exciting world of Bitcoin. Now, before we dive in, as always, we are giving away Jan Pritzker's book, Inventing Bitcoin, for free in an effort to spread Bitcoin knowledge. You can go to swanbitcoin.com/free book to claim your copy. We have it in 3 different ebook formats and MP3 read by our friend Guy Swan over at Bitcoin Audible. All we ask is that you pay it forward by sharing the book with friends and family. You can share it with as many people as you want. Go out there, spread the good word of Bitcoin. Next, we also have the book available in Spanish, en español, y puede descargar su copia en www.swanbitcoin.com/libro gratis. Even more exciting, we are also giving away Gigi's incredible book, 21 Lessons. If you haven't read it yet, it is a must read. It is one of my favorite books about Bitcoin and going down the rabbit hole. Gigi basically shares all of the things that he learned while going down the rabbit hole, and you get to benefit from it. Go to swanbitcoin.com/21 lessons. That's 21 lessons. We have another book we're giving away. So many books, I know, but at Swan, education is our marketing, and as much as I would like it to be one size fits all, Bitcoin education is not one size fits all. Sometimes it takes a different book to get someone over the hump. So go to swanbitcoin.com/whybitcoin and get yourself a free copy of the essay series by Tomer Strolite. Now, as always, I got to ask, are you signed up for Swan Force yet? Because if you're not, what are you doing? Go to swanbitcoin.com/enlist to get started. Swan Force is our amazing referral program. You literally get paid for doing what you're already doing, for spreading the good word about Bitcoin. So again, that's swanbitcoin.com/enlist. I'd also like to welcome anybody who's new to the show. If you just happen to find us on YouTube, or somebody who said, hey, you should go watch that Swan Lounge show, and you're asking yourself, what is Swan? What is Swan Lounge? Well, Swan Bitcoin, quite simply, is the easiest, best way to get started accumulating Bitcoin. We offer automatic recurring buys. I do that every single day. I buy a little bit of Bitcoin every day. We also have instant buys when you're feeling like you just want to smash that buy button. And we've got some of the lowest fees in the industry for automatic dollar cost averaging, up to 80% lower than Coinbase. And finally, my favorite part is it only takes 5 minutes to get set up with Swan. 0 to 60, basically, 0 to Bitcoin in 5 minutes. You can send it to your friends and family. It's super easy. Next, what's next? Should we just get the show on the road? I kind of feel like we should. I'm really excited about this one. Yeah, we're going to do that. We're just going to get the show on the road. But before I do that, before I bring in our guest of honor today, do me a favor, hit like, hit subscribe. It helps us grow the show. It helps us get seen. It helps us spread the good word about Bitcoin. All right, it's time for Swan Lounge, folks. Today, as you can see, I am joined by this guy. I don't really like this guy. This is, I don't even want to say his name. Forget about him for now. But over here, we've got F.A. Hayek. And who is F.A. Hayek? Well, we will find out. Our real guests are alive and well, thankfully, and I'm going to bring them in right now. We have got Camilla, my co-host in crime, and we also have the amazing, the incredibly talented, the guy who sent me down the Austrian economics rabbit hole. You can't see her yet, but Camilla is going like this. I agree. None other than Stephan Livera. Welcome. Oh, wait. Nope, that's not what I'm doing. There we go. Welcome to our guests.
Hey, guys. Great to chat with you.
Great to chat with you, Stephan. Fun story for those, most people don't know this, but the first time I met Stephan, I think I talked to you a few times on Twitter. This was back at Bitcoin 2019, and I went right up to you. I don't even think I asked permission. I just gave you a big old bear hug, and you were like, who is this guy hugging me? I was so grateful for everything you've done with your podcast, and I'm such a big fan. Now, next time I see you, I'm going to give you another hug, so just prepare yourself.
Of course. I would expect nothing less, Brecky.
That's the Bitcoin way on how to do it. You don't ask permission. You just go for it.
Free men and women don't ask permission.
Stephan, I'm going to ask you to move over slightly away from.
I got to get over closer to our boy.
Yeah. We don't like canes over there. All right, why don't we dive in? So today's focus is going to be essentially an intro to Bitcoin from an Austrian perspective. But I think before we dive into that, it's kind of important to kind of give a lay of the land. What are the key differences between Keynesian economics and Austrian economics? And, why are you an Austrian economist? When I was in college, I studied economics, which I later learned is not just economics, but Keynesian economics. And I felt like I had the, the veil lifted over me. It was a very unpleasant, yet also pleasant experience. So why were my college professors wrong? That's what I want to know.
Yeah. So look, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Essentially, think of it this way. A lot of the jobs that exist are in central banks or in support of central banks. And so I think that's why the schooling system is geared in that way. It's to sort of teach you, why the state is necessary. Why we need to centrally manage the economy. Or another way they might frame it is like, see, inflation is just this thing that happens out there. And we, the central bank, are here to help you. And that we are trying to fight the forces of inflation along with you, you pleb citizens. You should let us help us manage your money for you. And so one of the fundamental differences in the Austrian method is that it's really about subjective perception of money. And it's also about really looking through specifically what's happening at the level of the individual. Whereas a Keynesian or even a monetarist, they tend to be looking at aggregates. They tend to be looking at, what's happening with the price level? What's happening with aggregate demand? Whereas to an Austrian, that doesn't really make sense because you can't add up that demand across the different people, if you will. That your demand, you can't necessarily add your demand. Let me put it this way. Austrians believe in something called ordinal value scales, not cardinal value scales. So as an example, you might say, I can rank, say I've got 10 best friends and I can rank them in, here's my closest best friend, here's my 10th best friend. But you can't sort of add them and you can't, and so in the neoclassical framework, they think of it a little bit more like that. Like you can just add these things up.
Like how do you add diamonds and apples? You can't. Those aren't the same thing. You can't add them up. It doesn't make any sense.
Right. Exactly right. And so it all comes down to what are the individuals doing? Because what happens sometimes is we can miss things when we just put them into that like aggregate, when we just kind of aggregate the numbers without really appreciating what's going on at that ground level. And so a Keynesian might be thinking, look, see, there is an output gap because we don't have enough aggregate demand. Therefore, the government should step in, either fiscal policy, spending more money, or there should be monetary policy, printing more money, to make use of that unused demand. So that's one example. So I guess bringing you back to answer your question, it's fundamentally just a different method of economics. It's a method focused on subjective value and a method focused on deductively reasoning out the conclusions based on certain axioms that we understand. So man acts purposefully is an example. And then from that, you can reason out and deduce out these other principles. Whereas the methods applied by other schools of economics tend to be more positivist. What does that mean? It means more like this idea of, I ran some numbers in terms of how the unemployment numbers went. And because in this circumstance, unemployment didn't rise when I raised the prices, the minimum wage, therefore we don't know that minimum wages will cause more unemployment. Like it's sort of looking at just what happened in this time at this place when in reality, we don't know all the other factors that went into that. And so really, if you don't have a deductive method, you won't know if something happened in spite of a government policy or because of it. And so if a government politician or bureaucrat comes out saying, look, see, we did this and it made things better, you don't know if it was because of that policy or because in spite of it. And so an Austrian method is actually diving further into the detail to sort of understand exactly why was that the way it was. Now, bringing it to kind of fiat money, we think of it more like, how did money arise and how does it arise and what are the different ways that it can, different conceptions people have around that, and why do we use particular forms of money and what are the impacts of certain interventions into money? And this is where obviously the Bitcoin conversation comes in.
Let's pull it back to some of the things you were just talking about. So, I was kind of giving myself a little refresher course on Austrian economics last night, and I tried to read this and I tried to read this, and I honestly fell asleep. But I did pick up I did pick up a few things. You were talking about deduction, and I was having this strange thought that Austrian economics is almost like the Sherlock Holmes of economics. You know,
yeah,
right?
I think
like
so.
You kind of say, okay, this makes sense, therefore this makes sense, therefore this is probable, and yeah. Now, like the Keynesian economists, and the thing that I was kind of getting not hung up on, but I guess what I don't understand from their perspective is they want to apply the scientific method, which I think is great, admirable. We should use the scientific method for most things. But the fact that you can't conduct an experiment on the economy itself because the economy is never stopping, like how do they make that leap from a couple of, from a mathematical equation to defining everything? I don't get that.
Yeah, great point. And so what happens is in the modern mainstream macroeconomics world and the investor macro world, people just talk about various different factors. They'd be like, oh, look, the lumber in this region is down, and that's why the supply constraint over here. But the thing is, they are all just trying to understand which factor is more important. Because what happens is, because there's like hundreds of different variables, if something doesn't go the way you predicted, you can just say, oh, look, see, it was because this other thing changed. And as you were saying, so in economics, there's this idea of ceteris paribus, all other things equal. But the reality is we live in a world where we can't actually run that experiment. We can't actually go and find the parallel Earth with a parallel Brecci and Camilla and Stephan. We can't run that experiment. And so that's why we have to use a different method. We need to use the Austrian method. And so people who are interested to learn a little bit more about the Austrian method, one of my favorites on this topic is called Economic Science and the Austrian Method by Hans Hermann Hoppe. You can find that for free on Mises.org. So that's mises.org. You can find that there. And that's like a relatively short, readable explanation of the deductive method, of the Sherlock Holmesian method, if you will. But yeah, I would say one key differentiator though is Austrian economics, in some sense, it's deductive, not inductive. Mm-hmm. So it means like you start from this premise and you reason down. You don't sort of inductively extrapolate forward, if that makes sense. It's a bit of a subtle technical thing, but that's quintessentially what the Austrian method is. And so it leads to very different conclusions. Obviously, Austrian economists, generally speaking, are very free market economists. But there is a difference there between your economics and how you are politically, right? You could be an Austrian economist who is not a libertarian. You don't have to be. It just so happens that many Austrian economists are libertarians, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. So then maybe like an example of maybe the difference. So like World War II, for example, right? Like a Keynesian would say that, the economy was stimulated because of all the spending from the war. And an Austrian would be like, no, you have absolutely no way of proving that, basically.
Right. And so an Austrian might think of it more like they would have more of an appreciation of what those people would have otherwise done. An Austrian would have more of an appreciation for where all the resources that went into the bombs and the tanks and the planes and all of that, all those resources could have been pushed into somewhere else. And so this is actually a thing as well, because in the Keynesian world, they just don't really appreciate this parable of the broken window. And even in recent times, one of the modern, if you will, proponents of the Keynesian method is Paul Krugman, who has a New York Times column. He's got 4 or 5 million followers. The last I checked, he's a household name in the economics world. And he has literally come out saying, oh, you know what? Maybe if we had, this is after like a big crash. He came out saying, well, maybe if there was like an alien invasion or a belief in the alien invasion, that somehow humanity would go and produce more stuff, and that would like shock our economy into producing more. Whereas an Austrian would obviously point at that and be like, no, see, because all the resources that humanity put into creating, turrets and surface-to-air missiles for defense might not be the best and most productive use, because all those individual people, right, coming back to what the individual wants to do, might have otherwise put that money into feeding their family or into doing something else.
Let's say I take Human Action here, which is a very heavy book, okay? I take it and I smash my computer like that. That's not stimulating the economy? Why is that not stimulating the economy?
That's great. Yeah, that's a great analogy. And so I love it. I love what you're doing there. So that's the same lesson as the broken window, the parable of the broken window. So this story, if you read Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson, and you can find that for free online. And I believe Mises Institute are actually doing a new version of that. So that should be out shortly if it's not already out. And you can see, so the moral, I guess the story goes like this, that, okay, in the village, people wake up and they see, oh, the baker's window has been broken. And so some people in the town are saying, oh, look, see, now that window got broken, well, that's going to spur demand for the glassmaker. So look how good this is. It's going to spur productivity because the glassmaker is going to have some job. He's going to have business. The baker is going to have to pay that glassmaker. But what is that ignoring? It's ignoring the fact that if that baker did not put that money into making the window again, he could have put those resources somewhere else. He might have went and bought a new oven. He could have employed a new bakery assistant to help him. So the true cost is not just like, oh, see, the glassmaker got some business to remake the window. The true cost is what that additional productivity and sales that might have come from making a new bakery oven or having a new bakery assistant, putting that money there. So it's actually understanding that what's the true impact of things. Or another way to frame it is to think of it like there's like a first level impact, but there's like a second, third, fourth order effects to so many of these things, where if you really understand the true economic cost, the opportunity cost, then that is, you're thinking a little bit closer to what an Austrian how an Austrian would think. And once you layer that on top of other ideas like subjective value, deductive, or what's known as the praxeological method. So, yeah. So, I mean, I want to be clear, guys. Like, I'm not professionally an economist. I'm just someone who's done a lot of time reading Austrian economics.
Stephan,
and
you're an Austrian economist.
So for me, I interview Austrian economists and I help explain some of those ideas. But I'm not a PhD Austrian economist, if you will, just so that's clear for people out there. But yeah, I consider myself a promoter of that school of thought.
Got it. All right. I want to move on to the concept of money in general. But before we do that, I wanted to kind of ask you about time, because I know time is very important to Austrians, and I know we're short on time. We're not short on time. What is the main difference between how an Austrian or a Keynesian respects time when it comes to understanding the economy?
Yeah. So I think Keynesians have a slightly different concept of interest rates. So they might layer in various other ideas like liquidity preference and other ideas. But I think the Austrians are those who focus more on this concept of time preference, which you might have heard, or you might have seen Bitcoiners talk about this idea, lower your time preference. Okay, so what is time preference? Okay, so time preference is, think of it as how badly you want something now versus how badly you want something in the future. And so if you are very impatient, that means you need to be paid a lot of reward for not being able to spend that money now. Right? So think of it this way. And I mean, just being human, all other things being equal, you generally, if you want something, you want it sooner than later, right? If you want an apple or whatever, you want it now, not in a year's time. And so you can think of it like just that kind of like a premium that you would have to pay for that. And so there are various sub concepts under this. And the main one is this idea of originary interest rate. But essentially, an Austrian view of interest rates are that they coordinate production across the economy. So as an example, you might have consumer goods, things that you can consume right away, right? Like my water or whatever. And there are capital goods. Capital goods are goods that you use to make consumer goods. But then it's not just capital goods and consumer goods. There are multiple levels of capital goods. You might have this capital good that helps you, let's say the table is some capital good. But in order to make that, someone needed a hammer and some nails. And in order to make that, someone needed some iron and some, and you can see how there's a structure aspect to that. So an Austrian sees that it matters the order those things were put in and the way those things were arranged. So a good way to think of that is that, as an example, if you wanted to have, say, 20-year aged whiskey, Brecky, you seem like likes to have a bit of aged whiskey or whatever. In order for that to happen, in order for someone to get you the 20-year aged whiskey, they've got to have the barrels and have set that up in 20 years in advance and be selling the stuff that they, in 2021, the stuff that they started in 2001. And so again, it's all about coordinating that. And so interest rates are a way of sort of signaling and a price of the cost of money, the cost of resources to help coordinate that process. And because in the Austrian, well, I mean, just in general, prices help coordinate these things, but interest rates matter for that reason. And so we would, critique the government for meddling with those interest rates or creating intervention into the market because it intervenes into what the interest rate otherwise would have been. Like as an example, if you have high time preference, you would be demanding a very high interest rate. Whereas if you have low time preference, you would be demanding less. So a quick example is if I'm super impatient, I might be like, okay, Camilla, if you want to borrow something, I want to charge you an interest rate of 20%, because I really, really want this now. But let's say if I was super patient, then I might be like, oh, okay, I've built up enough of a capital stock in my economy or whatever. I'm more patient now. I might only need 1% per year, as an example. Just picking numbers, right, to make it easy. But that's that difference between low time preference and high time preference. So think of it like high time preference people are very impatient, and low time preference people are more patient. They're thinking more about their long term. They might be like 10 years, 20 years down the line, or literally their children. Like they're thinking like it's a spectrum, of course. And so
So like our Swan customers who auto stack and they auto withdraw to cold storage are very low time preference.
Exactly, spot on.
Our Swan customers who withdraw to BlockFi are very high time preference.
Correct. Absolutely correct. Yes, because I think, in this industry, there's a lot of people who get drawn in because they're thinking like normal fiat world. And only in the fiat world can you get these kinds of returns. And I think there's a lot of risk associated with these things, and people don't understand that risk that they're taking. And as we always say in Bitcoin, not your keys, not your coins. And so you've got to learn. And of course, it's not to say don't even get started if you don't know how to. I mean, get started, but it's part of your learning journey that you want to learn how to use your own Bitcoin wallet.
There we go. All right. On to money, something that nobody knows what money is. What is money? How do you define money? And then also I kind of want to touch on, I guess we'll get into this anyway, but like the concept of natural money versus unnatural money.
Right.
A basic example of natural money is gold. I think that Bitcoin is also a form of natural money. So how do you personally define money? And then we'll kind of take it from there.
Yeah. So, I think of money as the most saleable good or the most, saleable commodity. And generally, the general kind of economist definition would be the generally accepted medium of exchange. Now, it's fair to say...
Wait, I have to interrupt you. I'm sorry. There was one question I wanted to ask you, mostly because I wanted to use this silly filter. Why is it called the Austrian School of Economics? Why is it called the Austrian School of Economics?
That's such a good question, yes.
I love it. So funnily enough, most of the modern day Austrian economist practitioners are actually based in the US. But historically, it's because some of them were literally Austrians. People like Mises and others were literally Austrians. And it was back in those days, in like the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was seen as it was almost like a put down. It was like saying, oh, we've got the German school over here, you guys over there in your little Austrian school, right? So it was like a put down term almost. And so that's actually where the term came from. And then eventually, like what's happened now is it's just become known as that. So, people like Carl Menger, who arguably is the father of Austrian economics, and then his student was Eugen von Barwerk, and then after von Barwerk was Mises, who is arguably regarded as, one of the top, Austrian economists or one of the top economists in general. And so back in those days as well, it wasn't necessarily seen like a big difference between Austrian economists and Austrian economics and just economics in general. It was seen more just like, this is just economics. This is what we're doing here. This is the praxeological deductive method, like we were saying. But then what happened over time is some schools of economics were more palatable to those people who wanted to take more power for themselves in the government, right? And this is where the Keynesians and the modern monetary theorists and other schools of economics came up. And they're not the only schools. There's Chicago School as another example. But the Chicago School is broadly free market, but they are a little bit more inflationary. They are pro-inflation. Whereas from an Austrian point of view, it's like any kind of money, any level of money could have worked. It's just more that what did the market choose? And over time historically, and I guess let me bring it back to your question around natural money versus unnatural money, because we think of natural money more like it arises on the market and it's chosen by the market. And so historically, for thousands of years, that was gold. And so that is probably arguably the easiest, most natural money, if you will. And then unnatural money is more like when the government mints its own currency, and often nowadays that's paper money or electronic money as well, that's not backed by anything. And so now that can be a bit confusing, because it not backed by anything. Historically, under the classical gold standard, there was a set exchange rate between the ounce of gold and how many dollars it was. And so you can think of it like this. Natural money acts as a check on the government, right? So gold historically acted as a check on the expansion of the government. Why? Because if a government was too much spending, engaging a lot of spending, that country would lose gold in outflows to other countries. And so that was a natural check. And so sound money, Mises saw sound money as a in the same way we would view things like the right to freedom of speech or like a Bill of Rights. It's there to protect all of our rights. And so over time, governments tend to impinge and encroach and encroach and encroach. And so what happens is they intervene in certain ways, like they have a central bank, they might have legal tender laws. And those legal tender laws help the degradation in the quality of our money. And so as an example, it's like trying to, let's say I had a gold coin, but then I also had paper tickets that represented a gold coin. And the government came out and said, look, we want everyone in the economy to treat these paper tickets just like they are an ounce of gold. You can see the problem there, right? Because over time, if I, the guy who owns the gold vault, I just go and print off some more tickets without having more gold in my vault, that there's going to be a problem longer term. And so that's not exactly what happened, right? But it's a teaching example that shows people how and why this government monetary intervention forces a race to the bottom in terms of which money we use.
Stephan, if the guy who's printing the paper gives Camilla the paper first before everyone else, isn't that really good for Camilla?
Oh, of course. Camilla loves it. Camilla would absolutely benefit in that scenario, because she gets to spend the new money before it has gone down in value. And let's say Brecky, you're getting it last. You're the one losing out there, because you had to. Brecky. Yeah. Sorry, Brecky. But you lose out there because you still had to earn, and you might be in a wage job. Your salary might not have risen, but you would still be dealing with the fact that your purchasing power is lower now, because the cost of the goods that you buy is just simply lower. So that's an example there. So essentially, legal tender laws and capital gains tax laws and some of these other interventions force a race to the bottom. And so we can see this in Guido Hulsmann's book, The Ethics of Money Production. And so in that book, he talks about a range of these ideas, but essentially it pushes people towards using low quality money because of government fiat. And so fiat means by decree. So the government is decreeing, this is the money of the land, you must use it and you must accept it as payment for goods and services or in extinguishing someone's debt. So if I owe Camilla, $100, she and I, it's forcing her to accept these USD coins instead of, something else.
That makes sense. It makes me wish I was a government, but I guess I'm not.
Well, something that's interesting is that a lot of people don't know that that's happening nowadays, right? That when the government prints money, it's not like the citizens are first benefiting from that. It's these big companies, big banks, etc., that are first getting this, and then it gets trickled down to the citizens. So it's happening today.
Exactly right. And so people don't understand the system because they just have Cash App or whatever, and they just use whatever their online bank, Chase or whatever, and they don't have a concept of like, how is that money made? How's the sausage made? Because you don't think about these things. And so what happens is there's a benefit in favor of the people who can get into debt and play the debt game well. So if you can be this huge fund manager or someone who can access really cheap credit and then go and deploy that into the markets, you are killing it. And so even for us as individuals, what's the typical incentive, right? You might finish your high school or university, you might go to work, and then what do people typically do? They save up and they get into a mortgage. Why? Because they know they can buy the real house now, and then over time, the value of that loan in real terms is coming down. And so it benefits people who are borrowing. And so it drives this funny incentive because now everyone wants to go and be in debt. And so when we're playing the fiat standard game, it's about who can play the debt game well. Whereas if we were living under a hard money standard, like gold or a Bitcoin standard, it would be more about saving first. You would save up before you buy things instead of going into debt to get them. Now, I'm not necessarily hating the player. I'm hating the game. I'm saying there's a problem in the game that we're all playing. We're all forced to play this game in some way. Or if you don't play that game, you're playing it at a penalty to everyone else. So what happens is there's a competitive market for housing. And so everyone who's not going into crazy debt, you're trying to buy a house when Joe Blow down the street has gone into massive debt to buy a house. And he's leave it up.
I'm sitting here in the house that I'm renting. I'm basically losing. Michael Saylor has gone massively into debt, bought tons of Bitcoin, and he's winning. That's an extreme example.
Right. But I mean, I'll tell you what, though. I think renting is the smart play, though, because think of it like this. You have a personal balance sheet. And so if you were to go buy a house, you'd have a mortgage. You'd be paying down the debt on that. And you would be tying up, in terms of your personal balance sheet, into that house. So you're tying up your capital into that house. But instead, if you are renting, and you're stacking sats, well, you're getting more and more exposure to the thing that actually is going up in value and faster. So it's pros and cons here, because to some extent, you have to learn how to play that game that we're in. And that's why, in some ways, of course, it doesn't work for everyone. But for people who are able to just rent and stack sats with the difference, well, then they are doing pretty well, because historically that has been true, right? If you were just stacking sats, you got 70% plus. So, and maybe that's not necessarily an Austrian economics point, but it's more just like a general investing and personal finance idea that if you have too much of your capital deployed into one asset, and that asset is not doing well. Now, in fairness, housing has done pretty well. That's, relative, like in the world of quote unquote normal world investments. But obviously, none of those things really compare with Bitcoin.
Wait, say that again?
None of those things compare with Bitcoin.
It sounds so nice. It's like music. You just made me feel so much better about my living arrangement, Stephan. I hadn't even thought about it that way. Well, especially because younger people nowadays, when they first get married and stuff, it's like, okay, you're married now, like go buy a house right now. But it's like,
you don't have a pick
if you have Bitcoin in your life, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'd rather stack sats right now. I consider it to be still super, and then later down the line, we'll see what happens.
Right, and I think that gives you a little bit more flexibility, right? Because we have this huge cult, right? So again, not an Austrian economics thing, but just in general, we've got this massive property cult, right? I had it back when I was in Australia. I noticed it when I was back in Australia. It's true in America and in Canada and lots of places. Everyone encourages the young people to go buy their bags. So the boomers and the Gen X people got in cheap, right? In the 70s and the 80s, property was so much cheaper than it is now. And yes, interest rates were higher, but also the multiple was a lot cheaper. So when I say multiple, it might be in terms of multiple of your annual salary. So an annual salary, it might have been 3 times an annual salary to buy a house in the 70s or the 80s. It might have been something like that. And so nowadays, it might literally be 10, 15, or 20x what your annual salary is to buy a house. So it's just simply like it has caused this big problem that we've blown up this massive property and stocks bubble that now the boomers want to offload their bags onto the young people. And so there's this whole institutional arrangement around it. And it's very easy to go and get debt to buy a house because that's what society pushes you into that pathway. And so it's like a indirect sort of scheme of bag dumping bags onto younger people. And everyone saw it, property doubles every 7 years or 8 years or something like that. And people just unquestioningly believe that. And you know what's really funny is people spend all this time searching for properties on their weekend. They're like, okay, I found a property out here, and let's go have a look. And this got 2-bedroom with 1 bathroom and whatever. And they spent how much time do they spend doing all this nonsense? When if you just stack sats and spend that time learning about Bitcoin, you would have done so much better. You would have a much higher net worth if you just stacked sats and just ignored all the property and stonked BS and just went hard on stacking sats.
So Stephan, this is why you're a great guest, because you just lead me right to the next topic without me having to do anything. You're talking about stonks, you're talking about all these things that I would categorize as malinvestment. So I want to call this, hitting my microphone there. I want to call this part of the episode, Bitcoin Fixes This, because I think there are a lot of things that Bitcoin fixes, one of which is malinvestment.
Yeah.
And we can kind of tie this into the Austrian versus Keynesian side of things as well, because, I think I'll play it towards the end of the show, where there's a great rap battle between Keynes and Hayek, where they talk about the boom and bust cycle and how all of this relates. So I'd love if we could kind of get into, how does the Keynesian world we live in foster this environment of malinvestment and boom and bust cycles, and why does it piss off the Austrians, and how does Bitcoin fix this?
Of course, yeah. So malinvestment really. So stepping back to that idea about interest rates, Austrians argue that interest rates should be determined purely by the market. They are not to be a government tool of manipulating the economy, whereas other people like Keynesians and others believe in this idea of using the interest rates as a sort of like an accelerator or a brake on the economy. That's, in their view, they think of it like smoothing out the cycles, and they just think the cycles just naturally happen. We're just helping manage the cycle. That's what I'm trying to. You have to put yourself in their view, in their steelman, right? You have to steelman their view. That's what they think it is. But an Austrian would critique that and say, no, hold up. That is actually messing with the price of interest rates, messing with the price of money. And that screws up that coordination aspect, right? The low time preference, high time preference thing. It matters what that interest rate is, because an Austrian explanation of that would be that because they have created this environment, right, of central banks, legal tender laws, capital gains tax, commercial banks, etc., lenders of last resort, all these interventions have spawned a fractional reserve banking system that causes more money to be created than otherwise. And so this lowers the interest rate, lower than it would otherwise be. And so when you do that, you create these bubbles, aka malinvestments. So it's not overinvestment, it's not underinvestment, it's malinvestment, right? So that point is key to understand. And so a malinvestment is like essentially projects get engaged into or started that could not actually be finished because the resources required to complete that project are not available, like literally not available. And so Mises, I believe it's actually in Human Action, makes that analogy of a master builder who starts out his home building project saying we need 10,000 bricks. But in reality, unbeknownst to that architect and the builder, we've only actually got 6,000 bricks in the economy available. Now, the sooner you let that architect and the builder know, the better. Because if you imagine you started building this house on the plan of 10,000 bricks. The sooner, obviously the sooner I told you, oh, hold up, Brecky and Camilla, we don't actually have 10,000 bricks. Quick, we need to rearrange the design so it works with only 8,000 bricks. But imagine I didn't tell you that up until the last point, right? So the earlier I tell you that, the better, because you might be like, oh, okay, thank you for telling us that, Stephan. Okay, we're going to rearrange our production and we're going to downsize and right-size our project such that it can be completed successfully. In a malinvestment world, driven by fiat money, driven by this Keynesian idea of intervening with the interest rates, intervening with central banks, that's the problem. So it causes the wrong signal to be sent out to entrepreneurs. And so this is explained as a cluster of errors, right? So in the normal free market, some businesses fail, some succeed, and that's normal. But why is it, and this is an Austrian idea, why do we see a cluster of entrepreneurial errors into one area? So why did we see the dot-com bubble? Why did we see the housing bubble? It's a cluster of errors all in the same area that was driven by this fiat system of fractional reserve banking, fiat money, and so on. And so the solution, in terms of why does Bitcoin fix this, is that essentially under a hard money world, there's no creation of credit beyond what was already voluntarily saved. So there may be some small amounts of credit, but we think it would be mostly equity. So meaning you would own a stake in a company. And we think that there might not be as much of a debt market like there is right now.
Like if you're going to take a risk, you're going to have to really think about it before you just go and, start building some widget that nobody needs, basically.
Exactly. And so in some cases, what this malinvestment is people, quote unquote, overreach. They try to build something that society wasn't, quote unquote, ready for yet. The resources to make that thing weren't ready yet. And so I'm sort of colloquializing it a bit there, but essentially the technically precise way is more like they engage in projects for which the resources are not available. Like literally, we know the resources for that are not available based on the time structure of the economy and the capital structure of the economy. So in a Bitcoin world, I believe it will be closer to a full reserve banking world, not a fractional reserve banking world. And people will engage in projects more carefully. And importantly, they won't be being sent the wrong signal, right? Because you could say to me, okay, Stephan, fine. Let's say you are an Austrian economist, but there's all this malinvestment going on. Why don't you just adjust your thinking and adjust how you act in the economy because of that? But even if you knew, you still wouldn't necessarily be able to. Why? Because it's all about the other goods that are available. And because all these people are being sent the wrong signal. And not just that, even if you knew all this, you are still competing against other people who do get access to cheap money at the Fed printer or because of the Fed printer. So you still are competing, and it's an analogous to how even if you didn't want to go into debt and you wanted to save up first and buy a property, guess what? You are still competing on the housing market against people who are using that cheap credit. Mm-hmm. So guess what it does? It drives the incentive this way. So that's why it's not hating the player, it's hating the game. The problem is the game that we live in. And for most of us, well, it's all our lives. All we've ever known is a fiat money world. We've never known a world with hard money. And so that's why it's hard to explain and understand. It's like we're swimming in the water, we're fish swimming in the water, and we don't understand, oh, wow, we're actually swimming in water. Like, what's water,
Yeah, that makes sense. 100%.
So I think we should move on to a bit of a Q&A. We got some good questions from the audience today. But before we do, was my... back when I was a shitcoiner, when I was trying to chase those pumps back in 2017, was that malinvestment or was that just stupidity on my part?
Hard to say. Like, I would say it's more just like it's more just gambling and just chasing wins. It's just kind of, just gambling basically.
Very high time preference, Becky.
It was. I didn't know what time preference was. I was praying for my shitcoins to go up, and then I found the Stephan Livera podcast, and my world changed.
Well, I'm glad you did.
Me too. All right, let's.
Well, that's what's funny. I just wanted to say one more thing. Like, it's saying that a lot of us have only lived in the world. We don't even know what hard money is. It's so true. Until people start learning about Bitcoin and what money is, what hard money is, it's just like Becky said earlier. You have like right? You have this field taken out of your eyes, and you've seen that we've lived a complete lie, and we keep going to lie. As a society, it's not until we really educate ourselves with what money is and how we can build a better future, not just keep like burning generations to come, because that's what we're doing. We're going down the wrong path for future generations. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Educate yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
And fun until you realize that you're a hamster in a cage. Then the wheel is no longer fun anymore.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, people would rather believe the comforting lie, and they're often busy, right? Because they're all working, and they've got families and they've got jobs, and they don't have the time to go and read these, 1,000-page Austrian books and things. And of course, I would love if they did, but I know that most people won't. So I'm trying to make it more accessible for people so they can kind of quickly understand this without having to go read, multiple 1,000-page books.
Definitely. I was doing some research last night, and I learned that there's a summary of this by Bob Goldberg that I need to go read.
Bob Murphy.
Bob Murphy. Damn it, Goldberg. Maybe I made that up. Anyway, all right. Let's go to the questions then. Shady Coder supporter. Let's see where you are. He's going to put Stephan on the spot, he says. There it is. No. It's so hard to find these questions. Question. When people tell me Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, what is the best response from an Austrian perspective?
Yeah, great question. So an Austrian would generally answer that there is no such thing as intrinsic value. It's all subjective. Everything, even gold. You could ask that question. Oh, hey, well, what's gold backed by? Oh, yeah, that's right. It's so the way to think of it. Oh, we just lost Camilla. But the way to think of it is, think of it like this. You could think of it like intrinsic value is not the right way to think about it. And if you really want to think like what's the intrinsic value of Bitcoin, you could think of it like how credible its monetary properties are, right? The fact that it has a scarce limit, the fact that it's an open, permissionless system, anybody can join it, anybody can run it, a Bitcoin node, or have a Bitcoin wallet on your phone, and you can send it anywhere around the world very cheaply. So if people insist on thinking of it like intrinsic value, even though I think it's not really the right framework, just think of it like the credibility of its monetary properties, if you will. So it's fungible, divisible, it's scarce, provably scarce. Those aspects, if you were going to think of it in intrinsic value terms, quote unquote, I would put it in that way. But like the technically precise answer is there is no such thing as intrinsic value. All value is perceived subjectively by you and me and everyone. So it's like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's a similar kind of idea to that.
Exactly. So, for example, there was somebody in the chat earlier who said goodbye to go watch Mark Moss. He valued Mark Moss's show over ours. But obviously, everyone is still watching. We love you very much. You value it over Mark. So,
yeah.
All right. Related question. I'm not sure I quite understand it. Ion Disruptor. What is the Austrian perspective of Bitcoin value? I think that means I'm not sure what that means, but I'm going to change the question and say, what do Austrians think of Bitcoin in general?
So it's a mix. So there are some who are very pro Bitcoin, as I've interviewed on my show. People like Jeff Deist, the president of the Mises Institute, is a sat stacker himself. So, and he's stacking into his own hardware wallet. So there are some out there. And on the other hand, there are others.
Bitcoin?
Yeah, sorry?
Is he using Swan Bitcoin?
Not sure. But let's
fix that.
Yeah, well, I'll check with him. I'll get him on our side. But there are others out there who are maybe not as much. But I would say people like Tom Woods, Bob Murphy, they're pro Bitcoin. Like they hold Bitcoin. They hold or use Bitcoin. There are others out there who some of them got confused by certain conceptions of things like the regression theorem and various other things that are a bit more technical and kind of out of our scope for today. But some of them got caught up in that. Some of them are just closed-minded. And sometimes it's not just an age thing. Sometimes it's like, only the young ones are into it and the old ones aren't. Sometimes it's more just about, are you open-minded? Because I think you have to be a little bit open-minded to see the value of Bitcoin. And then once you have seen it, then you start reading and learning and you're like, oh, wow, this makes so much sense. Why didn't the world adopt this thing sooner? Why didn't we have this any sooner?
It makes a lot of sense. I feel like with some Austrians, go for it, Camille.
I just wanted to ask, for those that aren't pro Bitcoin, are they more like pro gold, or what would be the answer for them?
For most of them, they're gold. Yeah, they're gold bugs. And so I think the technically precise way to answer as an Austrian, they would say, well, the market decides what money is. And for thousands of years, in their view, gold was, and in fairness, gold was money in the world. It's going to be a process of time and proving it out that people really do transact in Bitcoin and hold their savings in Bitcoin, importantly. So, yeah, I would say most of them are gold bugs, but there's definitely some of them who hold both, and then there's definitely some out there who are pro-Bitcoin.
I think it's also hard maybe because, a lot of the, classical Austrian economists, Bitcoin wasn't around when they were around. So it's like, how would they have thought of Bitcoin? And we can't actually answer that. So
yeah, exactly. And I know VJ Boy Party has tried to answer this. I think he believes that Mises and Rothbard would have been very much, in favor of Bitcoin. But of course, we don't know.
Stephan, I forgot to ask you about this earlier when I was talking about the Sherlock Holmes thing. I don't know, just an idea. I think it'd be really fun to write like an exploration of Bitcoin and Austrian economics as if Sherlock Holmes and Watson were talking to each other.
That could be a cool skit, you know?
Yeah. All right, we'll put that on the back burner. But all right, we've got another question from Reed Womack, one of my favorite Bitcoiners. Reed asks, would Bitcoin reduce the amount of derivatives and value stored in derivatives? I assume a Bitcoin standard.
Yes. Yeah. I believe he's saying under like hyper Bitcoinization. And I think the answer is yes. Because, well, first of all, if we were living under a Bitcoin standard, there wouldn't be as much need for foreign exchange, currency swaps, and derivatives. And a lot of that is where some of that derivative market comes from. And so imagine if the whole world was just using a Bitcoin standard, you wouldn't need to be going back and forth about having this many different prices. And think of it like this: if we're still doing barter, right, trading this and that, we still live in a quasi world of barter. Given there's the US dollar, Australian dollar, pound, yen, euro, etc., we're still living in a quasi barter. Imagine if everything was just in sats. You would need a lot less prices, and you wouldn't need all of these foreign exchange brokers and blah blah blah. Now, some of the other stuff in derivatives, that might still exist. I guess it's a harder question. I think we would, coming back to that same principle and idea that we were saying, that we would probably see a lot less debt. I think for that same reason, we would see a lot less derivatives. I think they would exist, but just a lot less.
Makes sense. All right. I think we've got one last question, which I think I know the answer. What is the downside to Austrian economics? There's no downside. Come on, man. What are you talking about?
Come on. No, I mean, I would say there might be some areas.
What are the common critiques of Austrian economics, maybe, and how would you answer those critiques?
Yeah. So one of the critiques would be that Austrian economists don't do maths, or they don't do modeling, whereas Austrians would say it's not that they're opposed to using numbers, is that they would believe you can't define what an economic law is based on the relation, based on the numerical relations. That actually it has to be deduced, right? You have to start from a certain axiom and deduce that truth. Not, and the analogy I've heard Bob Murphy use is, imagine, in school we all learn the Pythagoras theorem, right? So c squared equals a squared plus b squared, and on the triangle and whatever. And you wouldn't go and test that out by going and like getting a ruler and walking around and like measuring triangles to sort of see. No, it's mathematically proven. So in the same way, Austrian economics is like deductively proven out. So in order to refute it, you have to be able to deductively refute it, not sort of show, I was looking out in the real world and I found a triangle that didn't obey the Pythagoras theorem. No, that's not how it works, right? It's just mathematically true, right? So it's just an example, but hopefully that helps explain that. Other critiques, I guess, are really of Austrian economists. Sometimes Austrian economists are, so the joke is that they've predicted 17 of the last 2 hyperinflationary episodes, right? Because they're always saying, hyperinflation is coming, or the economy is crashing, and that they're perma bears who just always think that everything's going to hell in a handbasket. But I think if you are intelligent about how you read it and apply it to the world, it can definitely help you understand what's going on, so long as you're not like being unnecessarily perma-bear about the economy. So I think those are some of the ideas. I mean, there are other ideas out there in terms of critiques of Austrian economists or of Austrian economics. But yeah, those are some just off the top of my head.
Love it. I think that's it for questions. To close out, what I'm thinking we do is we'll go through a couple of your favorite resources. And honestly, I'm just selfish. I've got this stack of, one second. I've got this giant stack of books here. And,
Nice.
I've read this one. It's great. What has the government done to our money?
Great one.
Obviously, I read it because it was the shortest. Should I?
It's a good book, though.
As a human being with limited time, should I read these? And if not, what do you recommend, Stephan?
Okay, so I mean, yes, I believe you should, because it's like, if you're just reading the short articles or listening to podcasts, you're just getting a flavor of these things. Whereas if you really want to have a better understanding, if you actually go and read them, your understanding will be so much better. But what I would say is start an easier way in. So you might start with, what has government done to our money? You might then go and read Choice by Bob Murphy, or you might then go and read Man, Economy and State by Rothbard. And Rothbard's a bit easier to read than Mises. So that's one example. Another one. And then
kind of like the Shakespeare of Austrian economics literature.
He's very prolific, extremely prolific. Another easy one to read is The Ethics of Money Production by Guido Hulsmann. That's one of my favorites.
Or just listen to him on Stephan's podcast.
Episode 51, stephanlivera.com/51 for that one. And of course, listen to some of the episodes on my show where we kind of break some of these down ideas for you. Another one, actually an interesting one, is a short essay. It's called Deflation and Liberty by Guido Hulsmann. That's also a great one. And that will sort of explain some of these ideas. Otherwise, if you're more of a visual learner, you can find lectures online. So if you find Mises Institute's lectures and watch some of those lectures. But it's an important part of understanding how we got to where we are and the economics of how we ended up where we are in terms of fractional reserve banking and money and the world where we are in today. So, and having that knowledge helps you understand and appreciate the reason for Bitcoin, because it's only the Austrians who believe or can explain this concept of a fixed money supply. All the other economic schools of thought believe in changing that. They believe in some kind of inflationary money, generally speaking. And so they just think of it like, oh, so you just need to, the economy needs that inflation and therefore that's okay. But we say, no, you want your savings to go up in value over time, not to be continually debased and to force you into investing in these various different things.
Why would you want to save anyways if your savings are not going to be going up? Like, just doesn't make sense, right?
Right. And so I guess historically, it was true that if you saved into gold, it would store your value over time. It's just that the system got corrupted in certain ways, and it might not be any one individual's fault, but the system was a bad one. And so we're just trying to change that system. And this is the alternative. This is the real best alternative that we've got to fiat or gold.
And there you have it, folks. Buy Bitcoin at swanbitcoin.com. All right. Stephan, thank you so much for joining us. Camilla, last chance for questions. You got Stephan. I mean, you can talk to Stephan whenever, but no. All right.
No, that's it.
All right, that's it. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. We will see you next week with a guest who's probably not as fun as Stephan, but TBD on that. We'll see. And I think that's all we got for you. Stay tuned. I'm going to play one of my favorite videos. It is a rap battle between Keynes and Hayek, which will really bring everything that we talked about full circle, I think, and it's just a lot of fun. And that's it. Go to swanbitcoin.com, start stacking, and we'll see you all next week. Bye, everybody.
See you guys.
Lord Keynes, welcome, sir. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine.
Your agenda.
That won't be necessary. I am the agenda. Tell them I've arrived. And then tell them I've arrived.
And your name is?
Hayek. F.A. Hayek. Maybe. Freddie. Yep. Hey, listen, party at the Fed. Alright. 20 minutes. Lobby. John Maynard Keynes. F.A. Hayek. Yeah, we're opposed. We oppose each other philosophically. In the same studio. We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and the reason to fear it. Like low interest rates. It's an animal spirit. John Maynard Keynes wrote the book on modern macro. The man you need when the economy's off channel. Depression, recession. Now your question's in session. Have a seat and I'll school you with one simple lesson. 2029, the big crash. We didn't bounce back, economies in the trash. Persistent unemployment, the result of sticky wages. Waiting for recovery, that's outrageous. I had a real plan, any fool can understand. The advice real simple. Who's GIP altogether gets to Y. Keep that total low and watch the economy fly. We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and the reason to fear it. Like all interest rates. It's an animal spirit. You see, it's all about spending. Hear the register cha-ching. Circular flow. The dough is everything. So if the flow is getting low, doesn't matter the reason. We need more government spending. Now it's stimulus season. So forget about saving. Get it straight out of your head. Like I said, in the long run, we're all dead. Savings is destruction. That's the paradox of thrift. Don't keep money in your pocket or that growth will never live. Because business is driven by the animal spirits. The bull and the bear. And there's reasons to fear its effects on capital investment, income, and growth. That's why the state should build a gap with stimulus, both the monetary and the fiscal. They're equally correct. Public works, digging ditches, war has the same effect. Even a broken window helps the glass man and has some wealth a multiplier, trying to hire the economy's health. And if the central bank's interest rate policy takes a liquidity trap, that new money stuck in the banks, deficits could be the cure you've been looking for. Let the spending soar, now that you know the score. My general theories made quite an impression. Revolution transformed the econ profession. You know me, modesty, still I'm taking the bow. So say it loud and say it proud, we're all Keynesians now. We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and the reason to fear it. I made my case spread an inch, listen up, can you hear it? I'll begin in broad strokes, just like my friend Keynes. His theory conceals the mechanics of change. A simple equation, too much aggregation ignores human action and motivation. Keynes has a justification for bailouts, payoffs, by polls with machinations. Provide them with cover to sell us a free lunch. And all that we're left with is debt and a bunch. If you're living high on that cheap credit hog, don't look for a tool from the hair of the dog. Real savings come first if you want to invest. The market coordinates time with interest. Your focus on spending is pushing on Fred. In the long run, my friend, it's your theory that's dead. So sorry there, buddy, if that sounds like neglected. Prepare to get schooled in my Austrian perspective. We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and the reason to fear it. Like all interest rates. It's an animal spirit. The place you should study isn't the bust. It's the boom that should make you feel leery. That's the thrust of my theory. The capital structure is key. Malinvestments wreck the economy. The boom gets started with an expansion of credit. The Fed sets rates low, or you started to get it. That new money is confused for real loanable funds. But it's just inflation that's driving the ones who invest in new projects like housing construction. The boom plants the seeds for its future destruction. The savings aren't real, consumption's up too. And the grasping for resources reveals there's too few. So the boom turns to bust as the interest rates rise. For the cost of production, price signals relies. The boom was a binge, that's a matter of fact. Now it's devalued capital that makes up the slack. Whether it's the late 20s or 2005, booming bad investment seems like they thrive. You must save to invest, don't use the printing press, or a bus will surely follow, an economy depressed. Your so-called stimulus will make it express. It's more of the same, more incentives per person. And credit crunch, liquidity trap. The broke banking system undone, that's a wrap. We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer market. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and the reason to fear it. Like all interest rates. It's an animal spirit. The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economists. The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us today, and we will see you next